She came back after her 7-week sabbatical, and she had, out of the thousands of emails that had been sent and deleted, how many do you think she had Abby resent to her?
Welcome to the Redefining Sales podcast, and welcome to season 4. I am so excited to have season 4 underway and some unbelievable guests for you. Today, we've got Dr. Kristy Goodwin, and I'll give you the context first as to why I asked Kristy to come on the show. I have been noticing more and more with the teams that I'm working with that a lot of the time we might know what to do, but we don't do it and we've got into bad habits. Or huge proportion of teams are facing a massive level of burnout, particularly at the moment. We're in quite a tough economy, slightly more challenging market in times for most industries. And so I'm noticing this level as well around some of the limitations on performance are actually human-centric rather than skills or knowledge-centric. So I wanted to have this conversation with Kristy around really how do we as people, as individuals, how do we turn up and really play a high-performance game and be at our best and actually do what we know we should do? Because I think there is this massive level of exhaustion, fatigue, burnout that really is impacting our performance. So let me introduce Kristy, and I'm actually going to read out her bio because she is too bloody good to not do her full justice. So Dr. Kristy Goodwin is a Neuro-Performance Scientist. She simplifies the science of what it takes to amplify performance in the digital world. Kristy's the author of Dear Digital, We Need to Talk and Raising Your Child in a Digital World, described by her clients as the pracademic. I love that word. Kristy translates cutting-edge research into realistic strategies to bolster productivity and enhance well-being in the always-on, digitally demanding world. Now, I'm actually just going to pause on that bit. I think this is also one of the things I love about Kristy. As well as being a business owner, a very, very in-demand keynote speaker, she is also a mum of 3 relatively young boys. And I think that's why she's so practical and provides those realistic things that you can actually do in your day, because Kristy is literally balancing a business and 3 children, which is unbelievable. And I have no idea how she does it. Kristy's worked with small organizations right the way through to large organizations, and she's really helping employees and their leaders to ignite their peak performance, both in professional life and also through to our personal lives. And she talks about really how can she help people be like a powered up version of themselves, a high res version of themselves, by really living and working with our brains and bodies in the way that they were designed and really tapping into our human operating system, which she calls their HOS. So grab your coffee, pad and pen, because you've got some really scientifically backed, highly practical tips coming your way. Kristy, welcome to the Redefining Sales podcast. I am so excited to have you on. We have been talking about this for ages. We've been planning all different hot topics. I know there's going to be so much gold in this conversation, so thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Abby, and I'm grateful that our calendars could align so we could finally get around to having this conversation.
We got there in the end. 2 business owners, mums, people on the speaking circuit. It was a pretty mean feat to try and get diaries in alignment.
We've done it.
So I want to start out with a bit of your backstory, because I think that how you came to focus on human potential, I think is actually such an interesting story. I think it will resonate with so many people. And I think there's so many unbelievable lessons in it. So I know you were already focusing on digital well-being. You were working with schools. You were already a doctor and sort of had that scientific backing and research to your work. But then you kind of made a bit of a pivot towards human performance and working with businesses. Can you talk us through a bit of the backstory that got you there?
Yeah, sure. So as you said, I started off as an educator and an academic, studying the impact of technology on children and teenagers developing brains and bodies. And that gradually transitioned into speaking more about adults. A lot of parents would come up at the end of a seminar and say, that was pertinent to me. Do you speak about digital well-being and digital distraction to corporate teams? And then we encountered the pandemic, and the digital well-being and the digital performance angle really became amplified. And so I, like many people in the middle of the pandemic, contracted COVID. As a fit, vaccinated woman in her early 40s, I expected it to be a relatively minor incident. I had plans of binge watching Netflix in bed and having my husband deliver me chicken soup, neither of which took place, but a girl can dream, right? So what happened was, not only did I contract COVID, but I had severe seizures whilst having COVID. And one Tuesday morning, our dog found me on the floor next to our bed, alerted my husband, and I was rushed to a code red emergency ward and hooked up to a ventilator. Doctors were at a loss to explain why. Why was a fit, vaccinated woman with no underlying health issues so adversely affected by COVID? After extensive testing, the only medical explanation that they could come up with was that I was burnt out. For years, I had ignored those whispers from my body: slow down, work in a more sustainable pace. And I adopted the Codral advice made popular in the 1980s, and I just soldiered on. And those whispers eventually became shouts. I had been pushing on, not only was I trying to do the digital pirouette as a speaker during COVID and shift from being on stage to online, at the same time, I was tasked with the enormous impossibility of homeschooling 3 boys at the same time. My husband had conveniently been deemed an essential worker. And so for years, I'd been working and living in ways that were completely incompatible with what I call our human operating system. And even though I research and speak about neuroscience, I ignored those whispers and I kept working in a frantic, frenetic and frazzled way. And so I was hooked up to a ventilator. I was unable to breathe and in this code red ward. And I was forced to confront my own possible mortality. I had been living and working in ways that were completely unsustainable, in ways that were completely incongruent with what I call our human operating system, that HOS, which is how we're designed neurobiologically. And I kept pushing on. And I think many of us are living in a way where we're always on, we are rarely focused, and we are never recovered. And so as I lay there, I heard the woman next to me through the paper petition curtain in that code red ward, literally taking the last breaths of her life. Mm-hmm. And I was forced to face a very ugly, if I'm honest, it was distressing, a really ugly reality that I may have achieved success, but I was paying what I call success tax. And I think many high performers can resonate with that term. We often achieve success, but it's often at a sacrifice, sacrificing our physical health, as I had done, our mental well-being and or our relationships. And so as I lay there and could hear that woman struggling to breathe and eventually take that final breath of her life, I made a pledge to myself that if I was lucky enough to leave that code red emergency ward, I would start living and working in ways that were congruent rather than in conflict with my human operating system. So that was back in 2021. And since then, that has been the catalyst for me to examine how I was operating. I think many of us are living in ways that are completely unsustainable. And that's why I think stress and burnout are rampant at the moment. So I look at how do we get people, including myself, to live what I call powered up, high res versions of our lives. How can we start to work and live in ways that support us rather than stifle us? So it was that awful experience that sort of led me to where I am today. And it's something that I see with many high performers. It's that high performance, but we pay the success tax along the way.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. Oh my God, I got goosebumps several times during that. I was like, oh, because that's, I appreciate that's a very personal story. So thank you. And I think there's so many lessons in that. And there's so many things that I want to unpack. I've written a heap of notes of different things I want to unpack. But I guess in terms of a starting point, how do we, you're a highly driven person, a lot of our audience are driven, I'm driven. How do you kind of start balancing that? Balance is the wrong word, but whatever the word is, but how do you go with the fact of how can I still feel I'm achieving, I'm progressing, I'm following some of my career ambitions or some of my ambitions, but also, not pay the success tax, because that's the kind of, $1 million question really is how do you pull that off? Do you have any thoughts around that?
I do. And to be honest, this is something I'm still grappling with. I'm by no means perfect at this. And I do often think we see a tension between how can I reconcile the fact that I want to live an ambitious, powered up, high res life with our biological constraints as humans. I often say, unfortunately, as humans, we have some neurobiological constraints that we just simply cannot outperform. As humans, we have almost a biological blueprint that we need to adhere to. And what I think that the secret of having success without sacrifice is that if we can unpack, discover, understand how do we live in a way that works with our human operating system. And I think there's really three large pillars. The first pillar is that we have to build our stress tolerance and our stress capacity. An inevitable reality in the modern digitally demanding world that we live in is that we will and do experience stress. How do we develop our capacity to dance with stress? How can we use even stress to catalyze, not constrain our performance? The second pillar, if we really want to thrive in this world that we now live in, is that we have to optimize what I call our FQ. For years, we were told the best predictor of our success in life was our IQ. And then in more recent times, we said, no, a person's EQ, their emotional intelligence was their best predictor of success. I believe the super skill of the 21st century is our focus quotient, our capacity to dedicate our focus in a world that's been engineered to be distracting. And the third pillar, if we really want to have sustainable peak performance, is that we have to reframe recovery. I often talk about recovery as a peak performance pit stop. It's not frivolous. If we want to perform at high levels, then we have to work again with that neurobiological constraint. And one of the interesting things we know is that the part of our brain is called the prefrontal cortex. So that does our mentally heavy lifting work. It's the CEO of our brain. Our prefrontal cortex only has a 4 to 6 hour battery life per day. That's one of those harsh biological constraints. So consistently pumping out 14-hour days all of the time. And I understand end of financial year, a big sales goal to hit, a looming deadline. Sometimes that is an inevitable part of the cadence of your days. But consistently working that way is working against our human operating system. And so I felt almost cheesy saying this. This is about not working harder, but about working smarter and learning to tap into how we are designed to operate as humans and then mapping that to the digital world that we all now find ourselves in.
Oh my gosh, there's so much in that. So let's go through the three pillars because I think that's maybe a good way to structure it. And I'm also keen to get your take on, there's sort of two hats that I almost wear when I have these conversations. One is the individual and the person who needs to take accountability and responsibility for my own performance and well-being and on all the things. And then there's the other one that's like the business hat. So for example, when you say about, the prefrontal cortex having that 4 to 6 hour lifespan, thank you. See, this is why you're here. This is why we've got a doctor here. There's also a business perspective of going, businesses also have to, hit the bottom line. They've got demands, and so on. And so I'm always trying to balance that business leader and business hat. And how do you get the most out of your people, but how do you support your people and how do you make sure your team aren't all having burnout? And there's also the individual hats. And maybe as we go through the three pillars, we kind of try and look at personal and business hats as well, if you think that works.
Absolutely.
And I think the other point, just to sort of set us up and then we'll go through the pillars, is I think for me, I've got a bit of a bias for sales lens for the obvious reasons. And I think that what is hard about sales as a career, as a profession, and for sales leaders too, is it is one of the most demanding careers. Like not many professionals that I'm aware of have, 50% of their salary in many cases that's commissionable. And hey, if you don't hit your number, you're not going to hit 50% of your OTE when you've got bills to pay, mortgage to pay, we've got a cost of living crisis. If you don't hit your number, then you're going to get put on a performance improvement plan and you're going to get put on a PIP and potentially lose your job. And every quarter, every month, depending on how you set up, your target resets back, your achievement of target resets back to zero. And here we go all over again. It's kind of like, it is ripe for burnout. And I know myself, I hit burnout in my corporate career and chronic fatigue and all the things that I said, yeah, would never happen to me. So I guess it's also keeping that in mind as we go through the three pillars, because I think sales is all professions have their own unique sets of challenges and they're all demanding in different ways. But those are the challenges I think we're dealing with as a sales profession.
I agree. It is almost like the ultimate profession for high stress. Like it really is a stress pressure cooker.
Yeah, and it's hard, right? Because we're not, someone I worked with who I love dearly said, we're not saving lives. We're not an ER doctor saving lives, but it's different pressure. You create financial pressure. You create, am I going to lose my job pressure? So if we go through the first pillar around stress tolerance and building your stress tolerance, how do we start to go about that? What do we need to know?
Well, most importantly, stress gets a bad rap. And the good news is, as humans, we are neurobiologically designed to cope with stress. We are, however, designed for really short bursts of stress, and we are designed to resolve or close the stress cycle. So biologically, in years gone by, a tiger chased us, we would have run into a cave, short burst of stress, resolve stress cycle. But pause for a moment and let's think about the sales professionals that are probably listening to this. We now live in an always-on, digitally demanding world. We go from one, potentially stressful email to a Teams chat to another WhatsApp message to a barrage of other Teams chats notifications. So we are living in an era where we are very rarely experiencing what I call micro moments of stress, and we are instead very often not closing out that stress cycle. So we are often living in what we call elevated or chronic stress, and that's not how we're designed to operate. And so we have to, I think there's 3 things we need to do if we really want to get on top of stress. And if we want to use stress, as I mentioned before, how can we leverage stress to catalyze, not constrain our performance? So I think the 3 things we need to do is 1, eliminate any micro stresses. Micro stresses are the tiny little benign things that accumulate in our days. The constant ping of notifications, having back-to-back virtual meetings. We even know the fact that when we look at a screen for hours at a time, as many of us do, we don't sigh anywhere near as much as humans. Now, as humans, we're biologically designed while we're awake to sigh roughly every 5 minutes. It's a natural biological mechanism to regulate our oxygen and carbon dioxide levels. So we sort of do 2 inhalations and we exhale through our mouth. And we may not even be aware we're doing that. But what we now know from research is that when our eyes converge, as they do when we look at our screens, our laptops, desktops, phones, etc., that narrow eye gaze means we don't sigh as much, and that triggers the stress response. So what can we do to eradicate just those tiny little micro stresses? Disabling non-essential notifications, batching or bundling your notifications. So rather than them dribbling in throughout the day and distracting you, can you bundle them up to come through at a set time? Can you create VIP lists? So let's say you're working with a client or a prospective client on a proposal. You probably do want their notifications coming through to you so you can respond in a timely way, but everyone else gets blocked. So firstly, I think managing those little micro stresses. The second thing we need to do to build our capacity to hold stress is we have to develop our stress tolerance. As humans, we have become incredibly comfortable with being comfortable in recent years. I don't know about you, Abby, but many of us shy away from physical stress. And when we are ill-equipped to deal with physical stress, we are also equally ill-equipped to deal with psychological stress. So I'm talking here about developing our stress tolerance. And, many of us have heard, I'm sure your listeners have heard, that the popularity of ice baths and cold showers, there's strong scientific evidence to justify that. A very quick 30 to 60 second cold shower in the morning will give you between a 250 to 500% increase in dopamine, noradrenaline, and norepinephrine. There is no known legal substitute that will get you feeling that high. And you're also developing that capacity to hold stress. So that we need to experience and develop our capacity, vigorous exercise, anything where we really push ourselves to develop that capacity to hold stress. And the third part of stress is becoming stress resilient. How do we respond, not react to stress? And one of the most scientifically validated ways to bring us back to a stress baseline is to sigh. Remember I said we should be doing it and we're not? 2 to 3 sigh cycles can be enough to regulate a stress response. And the good news is you can do them on a Teams call. Just make sure you're on mute because it would be very awkward with your colleagues if they're hearing you sigh. But there are little simple things, that narrow gaze that we have when we look at our screens, look out in the distance. Really pragmatic things that we can do so we can, as I said, respond, not react to that stress.
And I think what I love about your work is how you bring really highly practical solutions and also just, little things. Like I think I saw on your Instagram, I'm going to butcher this, so I'll get you to talk to it, but something around the benefit of even just a few seconds outside in sunlight, daylight. And I've found even on days where it is a heavy day, it is relatively back to back and all the things, even just, going, okay, I've got Kristy in my head, I'm going to go stand outside, or I'm going to walk to the end of the driveway and back. It's like a micro thing, but it still counts. And that's what I like about, some of the little things that you share. It doesn't have to be going for a 1 hour trip to the gym. It can be the micro things.
It is. And everything I talk about, I often present when I speak, I call them a menu of micro habits. And so the idea is that I present, science-backed, brain-based protocols that we know actually work. It's not, and I really steer clear of that word hacks and biohacks. These are not hacks. These are actually scientifically validated approaches, but they're the small 1%ers. We're not complicated as humans. We've just overcomplicated our lives, and we've shifted away from our human operating system. I heard a saying recently, and I just love it. And it's this idea that big doors swing on small hinges. It's not about doing a radical overhaul. It's just doing those 1% things all of the time. And as you said, just walking to the letterbox. We know that 40 seconds in nature drops our cortisol levels. 40 seconds. Like, these are not cumbersome things that we need to do. Having a face-to-face conversation with someone, even if it means getting out of your home office or your office at work and walking to the barista and having a conversation, being around other humans in real time will produce oxytocin. That's the social bonding hormone. It's the antidote to cortisol. And so there are really achievable things. I just think we, shifted away from how we were designed to operate as humans. Getting up and moving, sedentary behavior does not create the neurochemicals that we need to manage stress and to focus. We all feel better. I don't know about you, Abby, but going for a walk around the block for 10 minutes, I come back a very different person. I've often solved the problem I was agonizing over. I'm nowhere near as anxious or worried about whatever was troubling me. And we know that walking quietens down the part of our brain called the amygdala. So they're not complex things. We've just often forgotten what some of those basics are, what is part of that HOS that I often talk about.
Yeah, one of my team is fantastic at, she has a timer to stand up, and we'll be in a meeting and her timer and her alert to stand up will go off. And we love it, and it prompts everybody else. Yeah, and I think the other thing that resonates with me about this is sort of context for anyone who doesn't know. Kristy's got 3 young boys. 3 boys, I just don't know how you do it. I have 1 boy, and I just, struggle street a lot of the time. So how you have 3 is just beyond me, and a dog, and a business, and you're on the road speaking and working with businesses. And what I like about what you're saying is we're not necessarily suggesting go decamp to a health spa for the next 3 months, which is kind of what I wish you were saying, so I could play it back to my husband. You're kind of suggesting micro things that we can actually do. Everyone can do 40 seconds outside in the sun.
Yep. Yeah, and it's about knowing what really works. I think so many of us are inundated. We know the average adult is processing a whopping 74 gigabytes worth of data professionally and personally every day. It's called infobesity. I often describe it as the emoji of the head exploding. And so it's not about consuming more information and reading about a hack or trying something out. It's about applying research-based solutions. And one of the things that I'm finding working with corporate teams and with one-on-one coaching clients is when we track the impact of some of these micro habits on our performance, we can figure out what exactly works for us. And we're doing this at the moment through some what we call a neurotechnology, through wearable devices, where we can actually track in real time what happens to a person's stress using the technology I use with teams. It's called a Whoop strap. And using a Whoop strap on a person's app, we can firstly see their stress monitor. Now, no person that's stressed needs an app telling them that they're stressed. Let's be honest there. That is not what the purpose of it is. But what we know is that if we can see we're in that red zone, we're in that high stress zone, and sometimes we need to be. Perhaps it's a high stake pitch. Perhaps it is a presentation that you're really hoping will land. Maybe it's writing up this proposal and you're not quite sure which way to go. We are, remember, designed not to shy away from stress, but how do we bring ourselves back to a baseline? Because constantly being in that chronic stress will be detrimental to our physical health, our mental well-being, and our relationships. That's one of those biological constraints. So using this wearable technology, we can look at, hey, when I do those 2 to 3 sighs that Kristy talked about, have a look. I go from being in the high to the low stress zone within a couple of minutes. When I do that 10-minute walk, I grab the dog, I grab the lead, and I quickly walk to the post box and come back. Hey, my stress really drops. Hey, look how bad my stress is when I'm not getting enough sleep. I had no idea about the nexus between, my crappy sleep habits and my poor stress. One of the things I find working with a lot of high achievers is that we know we will feel more stressed, especially if we engage in, really vigorous physical activity. I think that's really obvious. But what comes as a complete surprise to many high performers that I work with and high performing teams is that we grossly underestimate the impact of cognitive stress. The challenging meeting, that pitch that we really had to be on for. With Whoop, you can see in real time not only your stress monitor, you can also see your daily strain. Let me tell you that if I do a keynote on a stage, my strain score is sometimes as high, if not higher, than a 40-minute spin class. So we know, and I think often we underestimate that cognitive mental load. Now, for most of your listeners, we are knowledge workers. We are paid for our mental efforts, our cognitive performance. I think we often think that it's only physical exertion that strains us and stresses us. That mental load that we often carry, and if we want to perform at a high level, we want that prefrontal cortex primed. We have to make sure, and this sort of ties into that third pillar, that we have to effort and recover. Effort and recover. We are not designed to be always on. And, if we think about it, even with our machines and equipment, what do we allow machinery to do in operational plants? Do they have downtime? Do they have maintenance? Do we do upgrades on our phones? Do we power them up? And so we have to start working in these ways that are both at high performance, but in a sustainable capacity. Yeah, it's something really common. I think we often underestimate that mental effort can be really draining and stressful.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's also, you made it the point earlier around the little things. I'm really actively trying to work on that one at the moment, even if it's like round the house, seeing the cup that's lying on the side, rather than just picking it up right now and putting it in the dishwasher and you leave it. And then 5 times during the day, you walk past, oh my God, that cup is still there. Why is that cup still there? Why is that cup still there? Versus just actually going, I'm going to get it off my mental load about a bloody cup. Like it's like you said, trying to eliminate the little things. Or I found at the weekend my son had swimming, and it's always a I don't know other word than shit show trying to get out the door to his swimming. And how do you try and go, right, we're just going to leave 5 minutes earlier so that we're not in that go, we're going to be late. Or same thing, for your meeting or for the podcast or for whatever it is that you're preparing for. Like, I think that's kind of an interesting concept you talked about removing some of the micro stresses.
Yeah, and we have to be aware, especially if you're leading a team. I encourage, when I work with teams, we often do something called a stress audit. And we actually look at a stress audit and a stress manifestation, because every person responds to stress differently and it manifests differently. For some people, it's irritability, it is insomnia, it is digestive issues. For other people, it's what we call emotional blunting. It might be social withdrawal. So this is the challenge, especially for leaders, knowing that each of your colleagues will respond to stress in different ways, and each of them will have different tolerances for stress. What someone sees as a blip on the radar is, for some of your other colleagues, level 10 on the catastrophe scale. And so this becomes really cumbersome. And again, empowering teams to say, this is what you can do at an individual level. And then also as a leader saying, what's within my locus of control, assessing, and this is hard. And I understand in the current economic climate, we're seeing redundancies and pressure to perform, assessing whether we've got manageable workloads. Creating what I call your team's digital guardrails. This is absolutely imperative in light of the right to disconnect legislation that's coming into effect in August 2024. Actually articulating what are your digital norms, practices, and principles as a team, so that your colleagues feel like they can switch off. Do you have, I call it a communication escalation plan, so that if there legitimately is an after hours urgent issue, what's the one mode through which that issue is disseminated to the team so that people feel like they don't need to be constantly checking emails at night. How do we respond after hours? Because these, I call them our tech expectations. We often have really different tech expectations. And if teams haven't taken the time to co-create, and it's really important, this is not an IT policy that's sort of written and passed down. There has to be some joint agreement and discussion about these digital agreements or guardrails. But coming up with some of those parameters can go a really long way in people feeling like they can switch off. So they're not in these chronic levels of stress all of the time, because we know stress produces cortisol. Cortisol inhibits neural pathways. So you just simply cannot perform at your peak when you are stressed. We know that instead of energy being directed in that prefrontal cortex that I was talking about, we activate our amygdala. That's the worry center of our brain. So we really need to do whatever we can at an individual level, but also collectively, how can we manage that team stress? And we've all been in situations, I don't know if you have, Abby, where we've got one stressed colleague and it has such a quick contagion effect. So from a performance perspective, trying to bolster that capacity to deal with stress at an individual and collective level is absolutely critical.
And this is what I love about what you're talking about. Not only is it science-backed, not only is it practical and it's micro and it's achievable, and I often have you in my head when it's like, it's only 40 seconds out. But I also like the fact that we're not just talking about, oh, look after your team's well-being because it's like, the right thing to do. And it is the right thing to do, but it's more than that. It's actually going for your team to operate at peak performance, for you to grow, for you to achieve growth, for you to grow your sales, for the team to actually perform. We actually have to look at how do we get the most out of, your most expensive a lot of the time and best asset being your people. And that's what I kind of like about the shift in the angle of what you're talking about with human performance, and therefore how human performance is driving business performance and real hard outcomes.
Yeah. And I'm often asked, do you lead with well-being or do you lead with performance? I actually think the two are inextricably linked. And so when we start to work the way we are neurobiologically designed, when we work in harmony with our human operating system, the well-being takes care of itself and we continue to drive that sustainable performance. It's not about doing more. It's about, as I said before, and I feel like I'm trying to sell you something here, it's about working smarter, not harder. It's about working the way we are designed, because it does not matter what app, what productivity system you've got, what hack you've read about. The harsh reality is we have to work the way we are designed. There's no shortcuts. There's no way we can outperform our HOS. So it's about knowing that. And then also I think not just knowing our HOS, but knowing how do we map particularly our digital ways of working and living, so that it works with that rather than against it as well.
One thing I found really powerful on that is I've actually taken my email off my phone. And occasionally that I have moments where I want to look at something on my email and I'm like, damn it, it's not on. But actually overall, it has been brilliant, because what I found was if I am not at my laptop and therefore I'm really not in a position to be able to answer that email, I don't know, walking to school to get my son, or I'm going to the airport to get on a flight to go to the next keynote or whatever it is, I'm probably reading that email on the fly, and then I go, I will deal with that later because I'm not in a position to deal with it. So then I end up looking at that email twice. I'm double handling it. And then I've also got the thing that, you read an email at 8 o'clock at night that you just really, really, really didn't want to read. And then, you can't sleep. And I've actually found that, back to previous point, I'm not saving lives. Yes, I'm running a business. Yes, it's important. Yes, I preach and believe in being really, really responsive to my clients. But a lot of the time, if I am not at my laptop and I'm on my phone, I'm probably not in a position to answer that email in a decent way anyway. So I found either option A of putting, the timer on it to go, right, email turn off at X time, or for me, because I couldn't respect that boundary, I had to just turn it off completely and take it off. That's actually been so powerful for me to not always be on, because I was hitting the burnout.
I love that. And such a pragmatic solution, and one that really honors the problem that you were just describing. Is I often say we have ancient Paleolithic brains. We have brains that were biologically designed to go and forage, hunt, and get information. When unsolicited information pings, alerts, dings. I don't know about you, Abby, but what are most of your notification bubbles colors? Are they red?
Oh, yeah. Oh, in terms of how many emails you've got. Yeah, it's all red. Yeah.
Is there usually a metric telling you how many unread messages, notifications you have?
Yeah.
Not accidental. Red, when apps were designed, red is associated with danger, urgency, importance. Would you feel compelled to check your email if it was in sky blue or a baby pink color? And we have something called the completion bias as humans. So we want to see that number saying we've got, 28,000 unread emails down to a more realistic level. And so we keep going through. So what you've done is a really good solution to that, because we get tricked in the online world into thinking that everything is urgent and important because it comes to us when our brains were designed to go and get information. So another solution that I've found clients work with, maybe they don't want to take emails off their phone. I actually think that's the best strategy. But maybe email isn't your Achilles heel. Perhaps it's social media. Do you get sucked into TikTok or Instagram? Are you obsessive about soccer scores or other sports reports? Whatever your tech temptation is, remove it from the home screen of your phone, because that is prime real estate. And we often, I don't know about you, I sometimes unlock my phone just to quickly check the weather. And before you know it, I'm triaging the 88 WhatsApp messages. Then I'm in Instagram, and then I'm checking messages in LinkedIn. We get into that vortex. Another strategy that can work if that one doesn't work for you is to log out of the apps that are your temptation. Now, hopefully, it creates some friction. One of the reasons we get sucked into the digital vortex is because there's no friction. We can pick up our phone. We don't even need to unlock it with a passcode anymore. We often just hold it up in front of our face and let the facial recognition activate, and then off we go. Whereas if I have to log in, hopefully there are some steps that will prohibit or deter me from using it. I've got to remember what's the passcode combination for this particular app. So it's just creating that friction so that we don't go down that rabbit hole. And as you said, being really mindful at night. I worked with a team recently, and they created their digital guardrails. And one of their digital guardrails was don't touch your box at night. Now, it was a little bit cheeky to say that, but they knew I'd run workshops with them, and we knew that at night, I don't know about you, Abby, but I tend to have more disagreements with my husband at night than any other time in the day. Night seems to be when we will snap at each other. It's biological. Next time your partner's, picking an argument with you, say to them, honey, my prefrontal cortex is off. My amygdala, that emotional hub of our brain, my amygdala is firing. Could we talk about this in the morning? And that's why we send the terse email at night. That's why we put the decimal point in the wrong spot in the email at night, because that prefrontal cortex is off and the amygdala is firing. It's why cyberbullying is rampant at night as opposed to any other time of the day. It's that, mismatch between the prefrontal cortex. It's exhausted. It's worked overtime all day, and that amygdala is in the driver's seat, and that is not conducive to optimal performance. The other thing you need to be wary of, especially if you are a leader, is what's the contagion effect of you sending the email at 10 p.m. We've all been in that situation, haven't we? Where we send the email and then everybody replies, and it creates that snowball effect. So making sure that our leaders are walking the talk, having those, solid digital guardrails, and clearly explicating. For some teams, sending after emails is fine, but that's clearly communicated to the team. Other teams say, by all means, triage your inbox at night if that works for you to be doing it, but schedule them between these particular hours. For other teams and their operational cadence, that doesn't work. So this really is bespoke, I think, at a team level, to actually just taking the time to articulate those tech expectations.
Yeah, I like that. I like the tech expectations as well. That is absolute pure gold. I like that one. So what do we want to...
I was just going to say, sorry, sometimes communicating your tech expectations to your clients. We're living in an age of instant gratification. Do you prefer text messages? Is a voicemail preferable? Saying to them, look, the best way to reach me is this. If it's urgent, please send me a text and I'll get back to you. We all have different tech preferences. There's another one for you. Different preferences, but taking the time, especially if it's a client you're going to work with in an ongoing way, and something you can also work with your teams. I've changed my voicemail, explaining that I am terrible at listening to voicemails, so please send me a text message. I often get a text message saying it wasn't anything important, but I'm going to copy your voicemail because I hate them too. So just explaining that to people can go a really long way as well.
Yeah, I found it definitely was alarming to me when I went through this process with the team, because I would send an email at night just sort of thinking, oh, they'll look at it in the morning, not really thinking through the fact people would look at it, and then you set the expectation. So I started scheduling my emails, and the odd one slips through the net and you're always like, damn it. But I try to schedule. But I've also had a conversation with the team to go, if I happen to be playing catch up at night or playing catch up at the weekend, then that doesn't mean I expect you to. It's because I've had a sick kid today and I'm playing catch up, and I have chosen, therefore, to do it now. So I found that expectation actually really helped, for all of us. And in terms of your previous one, I found personally I'm not very good at just logging out and logging back in. I don't think it creates enough friction for me. And when I'm feeling like I don't have enough discipline, I end up on Instagram. And so things like last week, I was having an overwhelming week and I had a couple deadlines. So I actually just deleted Instagram completely from my phone. And then I put it back on the weekend, because that was happening to be my weakness to help me avoid whatever I was trying to avoid at work. And so I found that for me, I have to create a bigger path of friction, which is like logging out isn't enough for me. If I'm in that zone, I need to just completely remove it.
Yeah, it's so important. I think what you just described there, you articulated those guardrails, and that's what works for your team. And there's no one size fits all. I often have people saying, can you just send me the digital guardrails that you create for teams? This has to be something that it's an iterative process, and it's about co-creating these at a macro level across the organization, but then having bespoke ones for each teams. So for each team is really, really important. So another thing I'm hearing from a lot of organizations is that a lot of people are reluctant to take prolonged periods of annual leave. And one of the reasons is that they're worried about taking that leave and then coming back to an onslaught of, a bulging inbox or triaging their team's chats. And so some companies, part of their guardrails are actually articulating what are the digital norms when we go on annual leave or when we're on a prolonged period of sick leave. And saying, I'm working with some companies at the moment who are making it a company-wide policy that during annual leave, you certainly need to have an out-of-office message on, explaining who the client or colleague should contact in your absence. But some companies are giving people permission to say that your emails will not be responded to during this time and will in fact be deleted. If it is important, please reschedule it, and stating the date upon your return, and giving them step-by-step instructions on how to reschedule an email. In my book, I shared that a lady called Sammy from Nike, who was head of social media at Nike, so a very demanding job, took a 7-week sabbatical from her role at Nike. She came back with that email message saying that all emails would be deleted during her absence. She came back after her 7-week sabbatical, and she had, out of the thousands of emails that had been sent and deleted, how many do you think she had Abby resent to her?
Ooh, I think it's going to surprise me. It's going to be something like 50 or something really low, ridiculously low, given what we would expect it to be.
Zero.
Yeah. Wow.
Zero. And this is what I talk about. In the online world, when unsolicited information comes to you, it feels urgent and important. One of the reasons, and I get teams to dig into why do we send the quick Teams chat? Why do we fire off the email? Sometimes it is the legitimate way to communicate, but often we do it because we want to, I call it cognitively handballing. We handball the problem to someone else. I quickly get rid of it and I'm passing it on to someone else. And so actually thinking about why we're using the tools and what the best ones are. But can you see how those parameters, that may not work for all organizations, it may not work for all roles. It might be cumbersome to implement in a sales capacity, but can you see actually having those boundaries gives people the right to switch off and to really genuinely recharge. So that we can have that sustainable performance. But it's, again, taking the time to figure out what works for your industry, for your clients, for your organization. And it's not, unfortunately, a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, I like that you've got to sort of try what works for you, what works for your organization. I've got one other example, and then I definitely need to move on to pillar 2, but something you taught me, which I love, and I would actually be really curious to understand how many extra emails you get because of this. If I email you, I get an out of office saying, I'm working, like your recent one was like, I'm working on my book at the moment on a book deadline, I'm batching and will respond to your emails. Basically, net, don't expect an instant response. And creating that kind of expectation, because like we're in a world where people expect instant responses. So you've responded, but you've also, set the boundaries and set the expectations. Yeah. I was finding that I would go and do a workshop with a sales team or a keynote, and I hadn't put that on. And so I would get off stage already like pumped because you've done a keynote, and then be like, oh my God, I've got all these to respond to. Whereas now I've started doing what you're doing, which is using out of offices more, because it's like, I'm going to be out of office for half a day, or I'm going to be out of office for a full day. I'm going to set my out of office on for the day. And even just that, I've found has alleviated a massive sense of pressure for me. It's like, okay, cool. I'm going to finish my keynote. I'm going to like chill out for just like 10 seconds. I'm going to like unwind, and then I will get back to it. But I don't have that sense of like, go now. And by just simply using the out of office to manage the boundaries and the expectations.
Yeah, it does work really well. The one I had the most, and I did get some responses. So ironically, the idea
I bet you got more emails, because I think I replied going, that's great, I'm going to do it.
Sometimes I did, but the one I got the most replies one was a funny out of office one that I wrote at a Christmas time, saying that I was on holidays with my family, and how we used to get, some people use their out of office as the humble brag, sorry, I can't get to your email, I'm scuba diving in the Bahamas, and they used it that way. So I played around with that a little bit and made out I was going on this holiday. It was a beachside holiday, and then I'd have my head in a book, and then I wrote ... but I have 3 sons. The chances of any uninterrupted reading time in the sand without, wrestling happening nearby and sand covering my book is really unlikely. That elicited, and it was lovely. It was conversational, it was playful, but ironically, that one generated a lot of replies.
Oh no, I always feel bad, so I reply to your out of office, and then I'm like, I'm just creating another email. So talk to us about pillar 2, about FQ, so focus quotient, like, how do we start to approach pillar 2?
Yeah, so I'm going to acknowledge in sales, this is a really hard one. I often say to people, unless you are in sales or customer service, you don't need email notifications on. So that rule obviously doesn't apply to the bulk of your listeners, because you do need to be responsive. But I think we need to look at what distractions are costing us at an individual level and at a corporate company level as well. We know that, let's say we're doing some sales analysis. We've got our Excel spreadsheet on. We're looking at the results of each quarter. We're doing that, what Cal Newport talks about, deep work. We're really focused, and all of a sudden it's the Teams chat ping. Maybe it's your phone nearby, whatever it is that distracts you. Maybe it's chatty Kathy that comes up to your desk, or talkative Tom and interrupts you. Regardless of how you are distracted, for you to get back into that deep focus state, we know it takes the average adult around 23 minutes and 15 seconds. This study has been replicated many times. Now, I'm not saying it takes you 23 minutes to resume the task. It usually doesn't. But for your brain to get back into, that state of flow where you're really there, you can see the trends, you know what's happening, you're hypothesizing, and you lose that flow. Around 23 minutes. Think about the costs of distractions throughout the day. And as I said, it's not just digital, people, and we're finding this more so, especially in hybrid work arrangements where people aren't necessarily in the office every day. What they're finding is that when they are in the office, they're often hijacked by their colleagues that want to have the quick chat as well. From a company level, Economist Impact and Dropbox combined last year to conduct a very large-scale study looking at the organisational costs of distraction. And what they found was that Australia was the second in the entire world in terms of lost productivity due to digital distractions. Average employees, not a record, not a world record we really want to have. Average Australians knowledge workers were losing around 600 hours per week, 600 hours per year due to distractions. 106 hours were lost to communication distractions that were not helpful. That equates to around $28,000 per employee in lost productivity. That is a huge amount of cost to organization. So I'm working now with companies to basically say, and we call this the productivity paradox. The technologies that were supposed to make us more productive and efficient are actually more distracting because we're not using them in ways that were aligned with our human operating system. And so this is at the expense of performance and productivity. So I often say to people, the best thing that you can do.
If you haven't heard the big news, I've decided to put my big girl pants on, get uncomfortable, and start really posting actively on YouTube educational content around the future of sales and how you can really embrace and adopt baby steps now on your journey, high performance sales, how you can really up your game with some high performance habits, and also how do we fulfill our potential so that we really can do what we need to do to play an A game at work and in our personal lives. So subscribe to the channel, follow along on the journey, and enjoy our bite-sized learning that will help you really power up your game.
And this is where the coaching clients that I work with and the corporate teams where we use some coaching programs, I get clients to identify their chronotype. I know you know what that is, Abby, but your listeners may not. Your chronotype biologically determines when you are most focused and alert, and it also dictates when you should naturally fall asleep, what time. And we basically fall into one of three categories. We're either bears, and we sort of hit our stride. Our peak performance window, or I call it our power up zone, is usually between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. We often have some lions. These are the early birds. These people fire on all cylinders. And then we have the night owls, people whose performance comes to life late at night. These are your colleagues that email you at 11 o'clock. These are your wolves. And so we have to try as best we can to map the contours of our day according to our chronotype. If we know we are best to write up the proposal and to do the analysis because we are the lion, we fire on all cylinders early in the morning, can we build a fortress around our focus during that period? Can you bundle your notifications or have the VIP list on so that those critical people can get through, but everyone else gets blocked? Can you, during your peak, and not every day, I'm not suggesting that you need to do this, but a McKinsey & Co study found that most knowledge workers were spending 5% of their week doing their most taxing work in their most productive hours. They bumped that up just to 20%. So the equivalent of one full day of their week said, let's get our most productive work done in our peak performance hours. What resulted was a 55% increase in productivity. It's that working smarter, not harder. So where we can, again, not all of the time, and I understand in sales, sometimes you're on the road, sometimes there are urgent calls, sometimes you've just got to get a proposal out now. Then what can we do so we can, as best we can, maximize that time so that our chronotype matches our work schedule?
It's so interesting because I've always been a bit of a night owl, and that's always been my thing. Like if you look back at when I was at uni, I'm the person writing their dissertation at like midnight. That is totally me. And I've actually found the hardest thing for me has been since having a kid, I've had to shift that because the evening is the bedtime battle delight, by which point afterwards I'm absolutely smashed. And I've actually found I can't work how I used to in the evenings. And even with that, it kind of creates a just for a laugh, and I really hope my husband isn't listening, but this is a brilliant test to see if he listens to my podcast. We had a debate this morning because I will read late at night and still have the light on, and he wants to just go to bed and go to sleep, and I'm still sitting there with the light on talking about how interesting my book is. And so I found personal factors, i.e. husband, child, have actually been the biggest impact on me trying to work to fit my chronotype. Do I just get rid of them both? Is that the solution?
What's the answer you want me to say? I am often asked by people, and I will say Western society really isn't set up for night owls, the wolves. It really isn't. We're really geared towards bears and lions. And so I'm often asked by wolves at the end of a keynote, hey, I'm a wolf. I'd rather be a bear or a lion. What can I do? Unfortunately, you cannot manipulate your chronotype because it's actually determined by something called your PER3 gene. So it's genetically determined. But your chronotype will naturally shift throughout your lifespan. So as you've described, perhaps you still aspire to be a wolf, perhaps it's still built into your DNA, but your chronotype has adjusted accordingly. So unfortunately, you can't manipulate it. We've got to look at what's within my locus of control so that I can, my mom often says, control the controllables. What can you control? Even if it's just having one day a week where you just I talk about build that fortress around your focus so you can get that deep focused work done. What can you do to try and optimize your particular chronotype? And a big one is that we often ignore our chronotype sleep time, the preferred sleep time. And this obviously has, flow-on ramifications in terms of our management of stress, in terms of our capacity to focus. A tired brain cannot focus. So there are obviously implications from not getting that part right as well.
So I want to do pillar 3, and then we've got to come to, because I think it will work really nicely with that, the wearables, the tracking, how do I even know what my chronotype is, all that sort of stuff. But if I can do pillar 3 quickly first around reframe recovery, talk to us about that.
Yes. So one thing I have noticed, and this was the reason I ended up in a code red emergency ward, is I just kept pushing through. I ignored the whispers from my body to slow down. I thought rest was frivolous. I thought it was unnecessary. I thought it's something I just do when I finally got around to taking holidays. We have to see rest as that peak performance pit stop. I often use the analogy that race cars in 2024 actually no longer need to pull in to take a pit stop. They're so technically and mechanically sophisticated that they could finish that entire race without ever needing a pit stop. The reason, however, they still do take pit stops is they don't want that race car crawling to the finish line. They want that race car finishing in an optimal state. And so we need to reframe how we see rest. Gartner have published some really fascinating research that says that people who take proactive rest are 26% less likely to experience burnout. The opposite is that if you do not invest in rest, you are far more likely to experience burnout. And these are fairly compelling statistics. So we need to reframe rest is a performance amplifier. And when I talk about recovery, I'm talking about rest. So I call them piccolo breaks, 2 to 10 minute breaks interspersed throughout your day, a little bit like a piccolo coffee. They're small, but they pack a mighty punch. So taking those 2 to 10 minute piccolo breaks throughout your day. The other arm of recovery is sleep. And this is where wearable data can be incredibly helpful. It's not just about the amount of sleep that you are getting. The coaching clients that I work with are absolutely flabbergasted when they start to look at some of their sleep metrics and sleep data. For example, we know it's the quality of your sleep that can be just as important as the volume of sleep that you got. And that can sometimes be good news, especially if you're a parent or you've got a sick pet or a partner. We for years have been told you have to get 7 to 9 hours of sleep. And don't get me wrong, that is still important. But we now know that the quality of your sleep, are you getting enough deep sleep? Are you getting enough slow wave sleep? And you can track that with wearable data. That is absolutely rudimentary to your performance. But we also now know that having a consistent sleep and wake time, and even if it's one or the other, both is ideal. But if you can just say, I'm going to get to bed at a consistent time, that we think can be a stronger predictor of your sleep quality than just how much sleep you've got. So this is where understanding what the data tells us from an individual biometric level can be so profound in terms of optimizing our performance.
And it's interesting. I like how you approach it from different angles, because I used to find this topic really hard. I've got a child who didn't sleep through the night till he was 4.5, largely for health reasons. Despite multiple sleep consultants, health consultants, all the rest of it. And that absolutely killed me. So when I heard stuff about sleep, I just kind of wanted to throw the laptop out the window, because it's like, I'm not having any and I can't really control that. But what I like about that is even actually just listening to that, saying, okay, I could have controlled a consistent sleep time, because typically, your kid will eventually get sleep at a certain point. And even if you're therefore going to have a disturbed and restless night, you could still try and control that element of what time do I go to sleep, or what you were talking about before with the piccolo break of like the 2 to 5 or 10, 2 to 10 minutes. I like that, because I think otherwise some of these recommendations sometimes feel out of reach depending on where you're at right now, work and personal life. So I like some of your suggestions that you can actually just take a bite-sized step right now.
Yeah. And it is those little micro habits. So when I started tracking my data, and I will admit, I initially started tracking my data about 6 years ago, or 5 or 6 years ago, with an Aura rig initially, and now I use Whoop myself and with my clients. And one of the things that I started to observe, and the reason I became obsessed, some might say, or interested, was that I had never made the correlation between why am I waking up at 2 a.m. many nights. And I started to look at correlations in the data, and the days that I had a really high stress level, so I hadn't resolved my stress level during the day, I almost always would wake up with those ruminating thoughts at 2 a.m. And so you can start to see correlations between your habits and behaviors and some of your other biometric data. So for example, when I've done a keynote, my strain, my effort score is really quite high. If I haven't had good sleep beforehand, and if I haven't had good sleep afterwards, my recovery score and often my stress levels the subsequent days are significantly poorer. And so we can start to see those correlations. And again, it's individual. There's not sort of a one-size-fits-all approach, but starting to see those trends in some of the habits and behaviors that you implement can really help you, I guess, make educated decisions. Again, rather than adopting the hack that you saw on Instagram and thinking that will necessarily work for you, you can make those informed decisions and look at how those little 1 degree turns that we talked about earlier, whether they do or don't work for you.
So I'd love to sort of, we've kind of gone through the 3 pillars. I'd love to sort of finish with a bit around what should I start to track? Because like you said, I think some people do get obsessive about it. And then there's a whole debate about that, which is a whole nother podcast. But I think what at a bare minimum are the top couple things that I should track, and then how to track. Because I was curious around that, because I know when I saw you a while back, you were always wearing the Aura ring, and I've got the Aura ring, and that's what I've been trying. And then now I've seen, on Instagram, and by the way, Kristy's awesome to follow on Instagram. You're very much talking around Whoop, and I know with your business clients and your coaching clients, you're using Whoop. So I'm curious around top couple things to track, if at a bare minimum, and then how to track of, do I use my Apple Watch? Do I use my Whoop? Do I use my Aura? Pros, cons.
Yeah. So look, I really don't. The reason I chose Whoop, to be perfectly honest, is that the research tells us that their sleep data is far more reliable and valid than any other wearable on the market at this point in time. And that could very much change. This is a dynamic market. From a sales perspective, let me tell you that the wearables market internationally is worth an absolute fortune. So if you can pitch or do prospecting to wearable companies, you could be a very happy salesperson. What we know, and as a researcher, I want reliable, valid information. The reason that was important to me is at the time, and this is why I experienced burnout, is I had terrible insomnia. And again, I thought I could outperform my biology and kept pushing through. And it wasn't until I started tracking some of the sleep metrics. And so I often say to people, the 3 metrics that I think you should really look at, regardless of whether you've got a Whoop, an Aura ring, a smartwatch, whatever it is that you use to track your data, first thing is definitely your HRV, your heart rate variability. It is the best overall snapshot of your mental health and physical performance. And there is no target metric. This is why it sometimes gets complicated. There's no sort of range to say this is a really good HRV. Unless we started measuring your HRV from when you were born, it is impossible to give you a prescriptive range. Generally speaking, the higher your HRV is, the better you are performing. The better your body is physically and psychologically responding to stress, the better it is able to perform at a high level. You'll probably find you'll get higher HRV scores on the day you get really good sleep and the day you have really good recovery. So I definitely think HRV. I also think our stress, and different apps have different ways of measuring it. Again, I was really quite impressed with how Whoop calculate your stress. It's based on a whole lot of biometric data that they pull in, and they basically give you a little radar. So you're either in the high, medium, or low stress zone. And then the third metric I really encourage people to look at is their sleep, not just the amount of sleep, but as I said before, the quality of the sleep. And the bigger one is your consistency. And ideally, we want you waking up and falling asleep within about 30 minutes on each day, if we can. They're the things that will really be the levers that you can pull.
I love that. So if you had to leave everyone with one thing, like just start with one thing, start small. I think you've given so many micro little bite-sized tips. If someone's going, oh my God, I've got all these points of inspiration, I need to go buy a Whoop, I need to change my out of office, I need to turn off my alerts, I need to do all the things, what would be your sort of parting pearls of wisdom to someone listening?
The easiest thing that you can do is to put your phone out of sight when you either want to get focused work done or you want to be present with a loved one. Research from the University of Austin, Texas tells us that even if our phone is on silent and face down, if it's in our line of sight, it drops our cognitive performance by 7 to 10%. Put bluntly, seeing your phone makes you about 7 to 10% dumber. So where you can, moving it so you can't see it, it sounds so simple, and it is hard, especially if you have become conditioned to using it, but that can have such a profound impact. We know it impacts the quality of our conversations. So, in the boardroom, can we put phones somewhere where we can't see them? That would be my simple one that I know really does have a profound impact on people.
I love that. That is fantastic. Look, Kristy, thank you so much. And for anyone listening, Kristy, you are so generous. You're one of the most generous people I know in terms of sharing the research, sharing insight, sharing sort of really, I don't want to say hacks because we've sort of said it's actually not hacks, it's scientifically backed, but like sharing bite-sized recommendations of scientifically backed things that you can do. So check out Kristy's Instagram or LinkedIn in the show notes. As we've mentioned throughout this conversation, Kristy will work with businesses and teams and individuals around making sure we maximize performance to then maximize business results. She also does keynotes. So, a massive shout out to Kristy that if you're a business or individual who really wants to be working at your peak, hit her up. The links are in the show notes. So Kristy, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure. I really enjoyed that conversation, and I'm glad we got our calendars in sync.
If you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Kristy Goodwin, check out the show notes for all of the links to Kristy's website, her LinkedIn, and how you can connect with her. And also, before you go, as I gave a shout out earlier, please make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, because we are now putting on big girl pants, getting uncomfortable, posting YouTube videos all around high performance sales, fulfilling potential, and the future of sales, but making it really, really highly practical, just like Kristy did with all things neuroscience. We're doing the same for sales and doing it in bite-sized learning chunks for free on YouTube. So subscribe and follow along on the journey.